On the morning of the summer solstice at a passage tomb on the Isle of Anglesey, a mound of compacted earth and stone built roughly 5,000 years ago, a beam of sunlight enters a narrow corridor and travels 11 metres through darkness to reach the back wall of an inner chamber. The builders of Bryn Celli Dudu designed this alignment with a precision that archaeologists still struggle to fully account for. No written record explains the method, no name was carved into the stone, only the geometry remained, and it still works each year in the early light of the longest morning. It is among the quieter of the ancient archaeological mysteries we'll follow tonight, and perhaps one of the most exact. What drew people 5,000 years ago to engineer not shelter but alignment, not walls against wind but corridors aimed at a specific angle of morning light? That question sits at the heart of this documentary. Tonight we'll follow several of these traces across 5 continents and across thousands of years, the lost civilizations that shaped stone with precision. We still cannot entirely explain the archaeological mysteries they left behind without annotation, and the long silences where the record simply stops. We will not arrive at conclusions, but we will follow what the evidence suggests and pause where the written word never reached. We will not prove anything here. That is not what this kind of listening requires. What it requires instead is a certain quality of attention, the kind that can hold 2 things at once, what we know and what we still cannot explain. In the arid hills of southern Spain, the walls of Los Molares rise from a site occupied around 2500 BC, massive stone and mud fortifications enclosing what was once a thriving settlement of the Copper Age. The walls reach 10 feet in places with complex gateways and watchtowers built by a culture that also smelted copper, shaped polished stone tools, and buried their dead in communal tombs alongside jewellery and weapons. The site was sophisticated by any measure. What remains uncertain is the nature of that sophistication, whether the large enclosed structure at the settlement centre served a civic or ceremonial purpose, whether the fortifications were purely defensive or something more layered than that, and why eventually the place fell silent and stayed that way. That silence is a thread that runs through nearly every site we visit tonight. What is worth sitting with is not simply that these places were abandoned, but how they were abandoned. Not gradually in the way cities typically dissolve into something else, but in ways that left the architecture essentially intact, as though the departure was deliberate or at least decisive. At Sarazm in what is now Tajikistan, a settlement with sophisticated water management systems and trade routes reaching as far as Mesopotamia was emptied sometime in the late 3rd millennium BC. The reasons remain unclear. At Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, a complex aligned with measurable precision to an 18.6-year lunar cycle, a cycle that takes nearly 2 decades to complete, was abandoned by the mid-12th century. The great houses still stand. The roads that once connected the canyon to dozens of smaller communities still trace faint lines across the desert floor. Someone built those roads for a purpose. Whatever that purpose was, it did not outlast the people who held it. Something shifts when you stay with these sites long enough. The question stops being what happened to them and becomes something quieter. What did they understand that allowed them to shape stone so precisely to align corridors to specific mornings, or to lay out roads and cairns and temple networks across landscapes? We are still only partially mapping. The Corbel dome of the beehive tomb of Atreus, built in Greece around 1250 BC, was constructed without mortar, each massive limestone block held in place by the weight and angle alone. That technique would not be matched in the region for centuries. The dome still stands. At Karnak in Brittany, more than 3,000 standing stones were arranged in rows, stretching across several kilometres sometime around 4000 BC, with certain rows positioned so that they align with the sunrise at the summer solstice. Whether the alignments functioned as a calendar, a ceremonial landscape, an astronomical record, or something that resists these categories entirely, the question remains genuinely open. What is not in dispute is the scale of the intention behind them. There is something that connects a stone chamber in an Irish hillside oriented toward the winter solstice, a network of brick temples in the Cambodian jungle built before the more famous ones at Angkor, a ring of cairns in the Scottish Highlands, where the angle of the winter sun still illuminates an inner chamber after 4,000 years. What these sites share is not mystery in the dramatic sense. It is rather a kind of precision evidence of people who paid careful attention to things we have largely stopped attending to: the angle of light on a particular morning, the movement of the moon across a cycle longer than a human life, the weight and grain of stone and what might be worth encoding into it permanently. We do not know what they believed in the full sense. We know what they built. We know where they placed it. We know some of what they buried and some of what they carved into the rock. The gaps are large, but the traces are real and they are detailed enough to be worth following slowly. So we begin not with the largest or most familiar site, but with a wall. The wall at the edge of the Copper Age. The outer wall is still there if you know where to look. It runs through the arid hills of Andalusia at a height that in places reaches above a person's head, large stones set into compressed earth, angled outward, as though whatever was being protected inside was considered worth the considerable effort of building not one enclosing wall, but several. Los Millares was constructed in layers. The fortifications did not go up all at once. They accumulated over time, ring by ring, as if the people who built them kept deciding that what they had was not quite enough, that the perimeter they had drawn needed to be drawn again a little further out, a little more carefully. Archaeologists date the main period of occupation to around 2500 BC, placing it in what is called the Copper Age, a period when smelting technology had arrived in the Iberian Peninsula, but before bronze became widespread. The people of Los Millares knew how to extract metal from ore. They made tools from polished stone that bear signs of considerable skill and patience. They traded, or at least they possessed objects that did not originate locally. And they buried their dead in communal tombs chambers capable of holding dozens of individuals at once, stocked with weapons, ceramic vessels and jewellery, whose craftsmanship suggests a society with both the time and the organisational capacity to produce things that went beyond immediate survival. That detail of the communal tombs is worth pausing on. Not a single body interred alone, but communities of the dead arranged together across generations, as though the boundary between the individual and the group did not dissolve at death, but simply changed its form. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of a society that organised itself around collective identity rather than individual lineage. Others suggest the opposite, that the right to be buried in a particular chamber was itself a matter of status, and that the accumulation of the dead in shared space was a statement of inherited power. The two interpretations lead to very different pictures of what Los Millares actually was, and the physical evidence, for all its richness, does not clearly resolve the question in either direction. The wall that encloses this settlement does not behave the way a purely military structure would be expected to behave. A perimeter built solely for defence tends to follow the most efficient line, the shortest path that protects the greatest area with the least expenditure of material and labour. The walls of Los Millares do not do this with complete consistency. They create in places enclosed passageways that do not lead to any obvious strategic position. They form interior spaces that some researchers describe as deliberately labyrinthine, narrow corridors between concentric rings that an attacker would find disorienting, yes, but that seem in certain configurations to have been designed with an attention to the quality of interior space that goes beyond what tactical necessity alone would demand. Whether these passages served a ceremonial function, a practical one, or something that the people who used them would not have thought to distinguish between, that question has not been resolved, and it sits at the centre of what makes this site unusual. What has been established is the scale of the enterprise. The fortifications at Los Millares cover several hectares. The watchtowers at the outer wall are positioned to provide overlapping sightlines across the surrounding terrain. The main gate is constructed with a sophistication that implies not just builders, but planners, people who thought ahead, who anticipated the movement of others through a designed space, who understood that architecture could control attention and direct the body through a landscape in specific ways. For 2500 BC, in a region that conventional history tends to associate with relatively modest social organisation, this level of coordinated construction requires some account of itself. The grave goods offer a partial one: copper axes, ivory combs, ostrich eggshell. Bees, that last category, is particularly telling, because the nearest ostriches were in North Africa. Whatever social system was operating at Los Millares, it had reach. It could acquire objects from a distance, which implies either active trade networks or a relationship with other cultures moving things across the Mediterranean through channels we have not fully traced. The settlement was not isolated from the wider world of its time. It was connected to something larger, even if we cannot say with precision what that something was or how the exchange was organised. Inside the walls, one structure sits apart from the domestic buildings in a way that has attracted sustained scholarly attention. It is larger than the surrounding architecture. Its position within the settlement is central in a manner that appears intentional rather than incidental, the kind of placement that in other ancient contexts tends to indicate a building whose function extended beyond ordinary habitation. Whether it served as a temple, a meeting hall, a residence for someone whose authority was partly political and partly ceremonial, or some combination of these that the people who used it would not have separated into distinct categories the physical evidence does not resolve. What it does suggest is that not all space within Los Millares was treated as equivalent, and that whoever occupied or used this central building held a role the community recognised as distinct. The site eventually fell silent, as they all do. The fortifications stopped being maintained. The communal tombs stopped receiving the dead. The people who had organised themselves here with enough coherence to build layered walls and coordinated watchtowers and shared burial chambers, they dispersed or changed, or became something that left different traces in different places. The reasons remain debated. Environmental pressure, shifting trade routes, internal reorganisation, external conflict. Each theory has something to recommend it, and none has achieved consensus. What remains is the wall itself, partial but still standing, and the outline of a settlement that someone once considered worth surrounding with stone ring after ring, as though the act of enclosure was itself a form of meaning. That ambiguity is one of the things that makes Los Millares worth sitting with. It is not a mystery in any dramatic sense. It is the quieter and more durable kind, a place where the evidence is detailed enough to generate serious questions, and not quite sufficient to settle them. What the builders were protecting, whether it was a population, a practice, a stockpile, or something, they would not have sorted into those categories as a question the walls continue to hold open. And from here we travel further to a site older still, where the questions take a different shape and the silence between the evidence and the explanation grows even wider. Before the river city's Mergar does not appear in most histories of the ancient world, which is itself a kind of fact worth noting. It sits in what is now Pakistan near the foothills of the Bolan Pass at the western edge of the Indus Plain, and it predates the civilization that would eventually rise to its east, the great urban network of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, by several thousand years. The site stretches back more than 8,000 years, placing its earliest phases in the 7th millennium BC, before the wheel was in common use, before writing had been developed in any part of the world we know of, and before the river cities of Mesopotamia had begun to take the shape we recognise from their ruins. And yet what archaeologists have uncovered at Mergar does not look like a beginning. It looks in many respects like something already well underway. The buildings at Mergar in its earliest phases were made from sun-baked mud brick, a material that requires not just the idea of shelter, but a specific and reproducible technique, a knowledge of clay composition and drying time and structural load that is passed down through practice rather than arrived at by accident. In some of the earlier layers, stone was used as well arranged in patterns that archaeologists describe as geometric, placed with a deliberateness that implies forethought about the relationship between one element and the next. What is difficult to fully account for is the precision of this placement given the constraints of the period. The builders had no metal tools of the kind that would become standard in later millennia. What they had was time-accumulated knowledge and some organisational capacity that allowed them to coordinate labour toward a shared outcome. How that coordination was structured, who directed it, what authority it rested on, what the people doing the work understood as their effort to mean, those questions do not have clear answers in the material record. The granaries are among the most discussed features of the site, and for good reason. A granary is not simply a container. It is an argument about the future, a physical commitment to the idea that surplus exists, that it can be preserved, and that the group which controls it has both the stability and the foresight to plan across seasons, rather than simply within them. The granaries at Mergar indicate a community that had moved decisively into settled agriculture, cultivating wheat, barley and legumes and managing its food supply with enough organisation to store what was not immediately needed. Alongside the plant remains archaeologists found animal bones from species that appear based on the evidence to have been in early stages of domestication cattle and sheep, showing skeletal signs of the gradual physical changes that selective human management tends to produce over generations. Mehrgar was not a place where people had recently discovered farming. It was a place where farming had already become infrastructure. What complicates the picture and refuses to sit quietly alongside the practical explanation is the evidence of ritual. In some of the earlier structures at the site, the walls and floors carry carving symbols and marks that have not been fully deciphered, and that do not correspond to any writing system that later developed in the region. Whether these marks represent an early attempt at recording information, a form of symbolic communication between members of a community, or something oriented toward a spiritual or cosmological framework that we have no direct access to, none of these possibilities can be confirmed or excluded on the basis of what survives. What can be said is that the people of Mehrgar, at a point in history when we might expect their attention to be consumed entirely by the demands of subsistence, were also making marks on surfaces that were not functional in any obvious material sense. They were, it appears, trying to say something that the act of building alone could not say. The layout of the settlement adds another layer of difficulty to simple interpretation. The buildings at Mehrgar are not arranged haphazardly in the way that ad hoc construction tends to accumulate. Their streets follow discernible lines. The structures relate to one another in ways that suggest planning rather than improvisation. A sense of how the whole should fit together that preceded the construction of any individual part. Some buildings feature what appear to be ventilation systems channels, designed to move air through interior spaces in ways that would have made habitation more comfortable and food storage more reliable. For a settlement that predates the great architectural achievements of the ancient world by thousands of years, this attention to interior environment is not what the standard account of prehistoric life leads us to expect. Trade complicates the picture further still. Among the objects recovered at Mehrgar are materials that did not originate locally: shells from the Arabian Sea coast, lapis lazuli, from mines in what is now Afghanistan, turquoise from sources even further afield. These are not objects that arrived by accident. They are objects that arrived because someone at Mehrgar wanted, and someone elsewhere was willing to exchange them, and some network, however informal, however intermittently active, existed to make that exchange possible. By the time Mehrgar reached its later phases, there is evidence suggesting contact with the cultures that were beginning to develop to the west in the territories that would eventually become Mesopotamia. What passed between them, whether goods only, or techniques or ideas about how to organize a community or orient a building, or mark a surface with meaning, cannot be determined from the physical record alone. The settlement eventually declined its early phase, giving way to something different, and then to something different again until the site was finally abandoned and the desert began to reclaim it. The reasons for the early decline remain unclear: climate shifts, soil exhaustion, the slow reorganization of regional populations toward the river valleys to the east. Each has been proposed and none has been confirmed as the primary cause. What remained was a foundation in both the literal and the less literal sense, a layer of human effort and accumulated knowledge buried under the sand, preserving enough of itself to raise questions that 8,000 years have not yet answered. And the detail that lingers after everything else has been considered is the carvings, those marks on the walls that no one has deciphered, left by people who clearly had reasons for making them in a place where reason itself was already evidently a more complex instrument than we tend to assume. We turn now from the plains of Pakistan to the wind-scoured islands off the northern coast of Scotland, where a different kind of structure waited, built not from brick but from stone and designed for purposes that the evidence suggests were never entirely separate from one another. The tower at the edge of the known world. A broch is a specific kind of structure, and that specificity matters. It is not a general category of ancient building. It is a form that appears almost exclusively in the northern reaches of Scotland, in the Orkney Islands, in Caithness in Sutherland, and the Western Isles, constructed during the Iron Age by people whose names we do not know, in a language that left no written record for purposes that the buildings themselves only partially disclose. The Broch of Gurness stands on the Orkney mainland at the edge of a strait called Ainhallow Sound, where the tidal currents run fast enough to be audible from the walls on certain days, and where the horizon to the north offers nothing but open water for a very long distance. It was built somewhere around 2,000 years ago, and it is among the best preserved examples of its form anywhere in the world. That preservation is both a gift and a complication, because the more clearly you can see what was built, the more precisely you can feel the distance between the physical fact of the thing and any account of why it exists. The walls of the Broch of Gurness rise to a height approaching 20 feet in the sections that remain most intact, and they are not simple walls. They are double-skinned, two concentric stone faces with a gap between them that was used to create a series of interior galleries, narrow horizontal spaces stacked at intervals within the wall's thickness, accessible through low passages that require the body to change its posture to enter. These galleries are one of the defining features of the Broch form, and they are also one of its most persistently debated ones. The structural explanation is reasonable. As far as it goes, the double-skin construction would have reduced the weight of the walls while maintaining their height distributing load in a way that allowed the tower to stand taller than solid wall construction of the same period might have managed. But the galleries are also space. They are enclosed, shaped, inhabitable in some minimal sense, and their arrangement within the wall gives the interior of the Broch a quality that purely structural reasoning does not entirely account for, a sense of layering, of depth. Within the boundary of the wall itself being something you could be inside rather than simply beside. The central courtyard of the Broch would have been open to the sky, with the tall circular wall rising around it and the galleries accessible from the interior face. Archaeological excavation at the site has recovered the expected evidence of habitation pottery fragments, animal bones, tools of stone and bone and iron, alongside evidence that is less straightforwardly domestic. The fire pits found within the structure show signs of having been used with a regularity and a formality that some researchers associate with communal or ceremonial activity rather than simple cooking. Hearths in ancient structures occupy a position that is rarely purely functional. They are also the centre of a social space. The point around which people arrange themselves and the way a hearth is positioned and maintained can reflect something about the hierarchy and the ritual life of the group that tends it. At Gurness, the fire evidence suggests a community that took the act of gathering seriously, that treated the interior space of the Broch as a place where something more than shelter was produced. The location itself demands some account. The Orkney mainland in the Iron Age was not a marginal or forgotten place. The islands had been inhabited for thousands of years before the Broch was built, and the landscape is still marked by the remains of Neolithic monuments that predate Gurness by more than 2 millennia. But the specific placement of the Broch at the edge of a tidal strait on a stretch of coast exposed to some of the most severe weather in the British Isles is not the kind of location you choose by default. It is a location you choose because you want what it offers: visibility, isolation, the ability to see what approaches from the water before it arrives, and perhaps something else, a relationship to the edge, to the boundary between the inhabitable land and the open sea that carried a meaning. The purely tactical explanation does not exhaust. Many cultures place their significant structures at boundaries. The line between land and water, between the known territory and what lies beyond it, tends to attract building of a particular kind, structures that are as much about orientations as about protection. The Broch form itself vanished as a tradition with a completeness that is in its own way unusual. Brochs were built within a relatively narrow window of time, concentrated in a specific geographic area, and then the tradition stopped. No gradual simplification into smaller or cheaper versions, no obvious successor form that carries the same structural logic forward. The knowledge of how to build them, how to calculate the double skin wall, how to construct the galleries, how to raise a dry stone tower to this height without mortar, appears to have been a specialised competency that was not passed into the next phase of construction in the region. Whether that represents a cultural disruption, a deliberate abandonment of the form, or simply the end of the social conditions that made Brochs meaningful and worth building, is not something the physical evidence resolves on its own terms. What remains at Gurness is impressive in the straightforward sense of that word. A structure that has endured 2,000 years of Orkney weather and still presents its essential form to anyone who walks out to the edge of the Sound to look at it. The detail that lingers after the dimensions and the dates have been considered is the galleries within the walls, those narrow interior spaces that exist between the outside of the structure and the inside, neither fully one nor the other, accessible only by lowering yourself through a passage that was clearly not designed for convenience. Whatever they were for, they were thought about. They were built with care, and they were placed deliberately at the boundary of things. From the edge of the northern sea, we move now southward and eastward to a wall of a different scale and a different age, one that wraps around a hillside in Bihar, and raises questions not about what was protected inside, but about the nature of the effort that built it at all. the weight of intention. There is a section of wall in the hills of Bihar in northeastern India where a stone the size of a small room sits fitted against its neighbour with a tolerance that a modern surveyor would find difficult to dismiss. No mortar holds them together. No metal fastening runs between them. What holds them is the weight of the stone itself and the angle at which it was placed, and the decision made by someone at some point in the 6th century BC or earlier to cut that particular block to that particular shape and set it in that particular position along a ridgeline in the Rajgir Hills. The wall continues in this manner for a distance of approximately 40 kilometres, winding through terrain that is not flat or forgiving, crossing steep slopes and rocky outcroppings and sections of ground where the logical path for a defensive perimeter would have taken a different route. The Rajgir cyclopean walls do not always follow the logical path, and that is the detail that keeps returning long after the more obvious questions have been asked. The name cyclopean refers to the scale of the stonework block so large that later Greek tradition attributed walls of similar construction to the Cyclopes, mythological beings whose size was the only explanation the imagination could supply for the effort required. The name is borrowed in the Indian context by modern scholars, reaching for a term that captures what the eye registers when standing beside these walls, a sense of mass that exceeds what most people associate with ancient construction, a sense that the decision to build in this way reflected something beyond ordinary need. The ancient city of Rajgir, which these walls once enclosed and protected, was a significant political and cultural centre in its time. It was here that Bimbisara, king of the Magadha Empire, established his court in the 6th century BC, and here that the region's early political complexity first took a form that left durable traces in the historical record. Buddhist and Jain traditions both have roots in this landscape. The hills surrounding the city are still dotted with caves, temples and shrines that speak to centuries of sustained spiritual attention. The walls in this context were not built in a cultural vacuum. They rose from a society that was simultaneously developing sophisticated religious thought, complex governance, and evidently an appetite for construction at a scale that remained striking even by later standards. What makes the walls genuinely difficult to account for is not simply their size, but the variation within them. Different sections of the wall show different styles of masonry, different methods of cutting, different approaches to fitting the stones together, different degrees of precision in the finished surface. This variation is consistent with construction that took place across an extended period with different groups contributing at different times under different leadership or with access to different techniques. The wall is not a single act, but an accumulation which raises a question that the physical evidence poses clearly without answering it: what sustained the commitment to this particular project across what must have been generations. A wall, 40 kilometers long, built through difficult terrain, with stones weighing several tons. Each does not get finished quickly. It requires a continuous social decision to keep building a shared understanding that the thing being built is worth the continuing cost. What form that understanding took, whether it was political authority, religious obligation, communal identity, or some combination that did not separate these categories, is not something the stones themselves can say. The sections of wall that follow the natural contours of the Rajgir Hills most closely are the ones that seem most conventionally defensive, positioned to deny an approaching force the high ground, to channel movement through specific gaps where defenders would have the advantage. But there are other sections that do not follow this logic as cleanly, that curve away from the most tactically useful line, and follow instead the ridge of the hill itself, as though the relationship to the landscape mattered in a way that pure military calculation would not have prioritized. Some researchers have noted that these sections align with features of the terrain that held religious significance in the Buddhist and Jain traditions associated, she said, with the region hilltops that appear in sacred texts, caves that were used for meditation, the pathways that the pilgrims used. Whether the wall's routing reflected this sacred geography intentionally, or whether the coincidence of alignment is the product of the natural fact that both the defensive and the spiritual logic of a landscape tend to be drawn to the same prominent features, is a question that sits comfortably in neither explanation. The walls were eventually abandoned, falling into disrepair before the rise of the Mauryan Empire in the 4th century BC, which established its capital not at Rajgir, but at Pataliputra, modern Patna, further along the Ganges plain. By the time the Mauryans were building their own monumental architecture, the walls of Rajgir were already becoming what they remain today, a ruin that is visited and measured and debated but not fully explained. The coins and pottery found in the area around the walls confirm that the site was a centre of activity, trade and cultural exchange during its active period. The inscriptions found nearby, though limited, place the walls within a context of developed social and religious life. None of this resolves the question of why the walls were built with such effort and at such scale, or what combination of threat and pride and belief made the expenditure seem to the people who committed to it not just necessary, but worth doing in precisely this way with these stones at this height, along this particular line through the hills. What the Rajgir cyclopean walls leave behind is not a mystery with a single hidden answer. They leave behind a set of choices about scale, material routing, and effort that speak to a society making decisions about how it wanted to present itself to the landscape, to its neighbours, and perhaps to something beyond both. The wall was a statement. The difficulty standing beside it now is that the language in which it was written has only partially survived, and the parts that are missing are precisely the parts that would tell us what it meant to say. And from these hills we move now across a much greater distance to a forest in Cambodia, where another kind of statement was made in brick rather than stone, and where the silence between the evidence and the explanation has a different texture entirely. What the brick remembers. Consider the brick itself before anything else about the site. At Samba Prey Cook in the dense forest of central Cambodia, the temples were not built from sandstone, the material that defines the more famous monuments of Angkor, the material that most people picture when they think of ancient Khmer architecture. They were built from fired red brick, each piece shaped and laid with a precision that after 14 centuries of exposure to tropical humidity root systems and seasonal flooding has kept these structures standing in forms recognizable enough to study in detail. Brick is a more demanding material than it appears. It requires kilns, and kilns require fuel, and the management of fuel in a forested environment is a logistical undertaking that implies organization extending well beyond the construction site itself. Someone was managing a supply chain. Someone was calculating how many bricks a given structure would require and ensuring that they arrived in the right sequence. The temples of Samba Prey Cook are, among other things, evidence of a society that had developed the administrative capacity to coordinate complex production at scale, and they were doing this in the 6th and 7th centuries AD, at a moment when the kingdom of Chenla was approaching the height of its influence before the more celebrated Khmer Empire that followed had yet taken shape. The site itself covers a large area of forested ground with nearly 100 temples distributed across the landscape in groupings that are not random. The temples cluster in ways that suggest deliberate spatial organization, a central complex surrounded by subsidiary structures, connected by pathways, and bounded by the remnants of earthworks and water management systems whose original extent is still being mapped. Reservoirs, channels, and embankments that once controlled the flow of water through the site have been identified in aerial surveys, and their scale indicates that the management of water was not incidental to the site's function, but central to it. In the Cambodian landscape, where the relationship between water and agriculture determines everything about the possibility of settled life, a community's ability to control water is inseparable from its social and political authority. The hydraulic infrastructure at Samba Prey Cook was in this sense as much a statement of power as the temples that rose above it. The carvings on the temple walls are where the interpretive difficulty deepens. Some of the relief work depicts scenes recognizable within the Hindu iconographic tradition, divine figures, celestial beings, narrative episodes drawn from texts that were circulating across maritime Southeast Asia during this period through trade and religious exchange with the Indian subcontinent. But other carvings at the site do not fit comfortably within the Hindu framework or within the early Buddhist one that was also present in the region at this time. Some of the motifs appear to reflect a local visual language, patterns and figures that do not have clear parallels in the imported traditions that seem to belong to a system of meaning that was already present in the landscape before the Indian religious forms arrived and was not entirely displaced by them. Whether this represents genuine religious syncretism, a conscious blending of frameworks into something new, or simply the coexistence of traditions that were practiced by different groups within the same political space is a question the carvings raise without resolving. The detail that refuses to settle is that some of these locally inflected motifs appear in positions of structural emphasis within the temples at doorways and the cornerstones, as though whatever they meant was considered foundational rather than marginal. The absence of inscriptions is one of the site's most discussed features, and it sits in an uncomfortable relationship with everything else the site presents. Other ancient centres in Southeast Asia from roughly the same period left behind substantial epigraphic records, stone inscriptions in Sanskrit or early Khmer that named rulers recorded donations to temples, described military campaigns, and preserved something of the political and religious thinking of the societies that produced them. Samba Pre Cook has some inscriptions, but they are limited in number and narrow in scope compared to what the scale of the site might lead one to expect. A complex of nearly 100 temples organised across a carefully managed landscape administered by a society with the logistical capacity to produce fired brick at scale. This is a society that was capable of recording things. The question of why the record is so sparse is one that the existing inscriptions do not answer, and that the architecture for all its detail cannot settle on its own. The astronomical dimension of the site adds another layer that has attracted increasing scholarly attention in recent decades. Several of the temples at Samba Pre Cook appear to have been positioned in relation to celestial phenomena orientations that align with specific rising or setting points of the sun at significant times of the year, or with the positions of particular stars that held symbolic importance in the cosmological framework circulating in the region. The precision of some of these alignments is sufficient to suggest intentionality rather than coincidence, though the interpretive question of what that intentionality meant, whether it reflected a primarily astronomical purpose, a primarily religious one, or a framework in which the two were not distinguishable, remains open. What can be said is that the people who planned the layout of Samba Pre Cook were paying attention to the sky, and that the relationship between the ground plan of the site and the movements of celestial bodies was not accidental. The Chenla kingdom that built and maintained Samba Pre Cook eventually gave way to the political formations that would become the Khmer Empire, and the site declined in prominence as the centre of gravity shifted toward the region of Angkor to the northwest. The temples were not destroyed. They were in a sense simply left the forest growing gradually back around them, the brick surfaces accumulating the moss and root damage of centuries, the spatial organisation of the site becoming harder to read as the cleared ground returned to canopy. What survived was the brick and the carvings on the brick and the faint traces in the earth of the water system that once made the whole thing possible. It is enough to ask questions. It is not quite enough to answer them. And from this forest still dense with what it has not yet disclosed, we turn now to a chapter that does something different, that asks, not what these sites contain, but what we might be getting wrong about them. The honest difficulty. It is worth stopping here before we continue moving through these sites to sit with a different kind of question. Not what these places might mean, but what we might be projecting onto them. This is not a digression. It is in some ways the most important part of the journey. The sites we have visited so far, the layered walls of Los Millares, the geometric mud brick of Mehrgar, the gallery-lined tower of Gurnis, the cyclopean stonework of Rajgir, the fired brick temples of Samba Pre Cook, each of them is genuinely complex, genuinely poorly understood in certain respects, and genuinely worth sustained attention. But complexity and poor understanding are not the same thing as mystery, in the deeper sense that popular accounts of ancient sites tend to imply. And it is possible, if we are being careful, to hold both things at once, the real gaps in our knowledge and the ways in which those gaps have been filled with explanations that tell us more about our own preoccupations than about the people who built these places. The first and most persistent of these projections is the assumption of lost knowledge. The idea that when an ancient society built something we find difficult to account for, their explanation must involve a form of understanding that has since disappeared entirely from human experience. The Rajgir walls, the Korbel dome of the beehive tomb at Mycenae, the precise solar alignment of Bryn Celli Dudu. These are routinely cited as evidence that the people who produced them possessed technical or astronomical knowledge beyond what their period should have allowed. But this framing contains a quiet assumption that is worth examining, that we know with confidence what a given period should have allowed. The history of archaeology over the last century has been in significant part a history of revising downward our estimates of how simple ancient societies were. Mehrgar had urban planning and ventilation systems 8,000 years ago. Chaco Canyon's builders tracked an 18.6-year lunar cycle without instruments we would recognize as scientific. The people of Karnak arranged more than 3,000 stones across several kilometers with alignments that still correspond to measurable celestial events. None of this requires a lost civilization or a vanished technology. It requires instead a willingness to accept that human attention and accumulated observational knowledge applied consistently across generations can produce outcomes that surprise us not because they're impossible, but because we underestimated what sustained attention is capable of. The second projection is related but distinct: the tendency to read astronomical alignment as evidence of astronomical purpose. When a passage tomb is oriented toward the winter solstice sunrise, or when a row of standing stones points toward a significant horizon event, the interpretive leap to astronomical observatory is so common as to have become almost automatic in popular accounts of ancient sites. But a building can be aligned with a celestial event without being primarily about that event. A church oriented toward the east is not an observatory for the rising sun, even though its alignment is precise and intentional. The solstice alignment of a passage tomb may reflect a belief about the relationship between the dead and the movement of the sun, and a cosmological idea expressed in architecture, without the structure functioning as an instrument of scientific observation in any sense we would recognize. The alignment is real. The question of what it meant to the people who engineered it is considerably more open than the word observatory suggests, and substituting that word for a genuine reckoning with the interpretive difficulty does not advance understanding. It may be natural in the broad sense for people who live close to the agricultural calendar to orient significant structures toward the moments that mark the turning of the year. It may be chance in some cases that an alignment which seems precise turns out to reflect the limited number of architecturally practical orientations available on a given site. The discomfort is that we cannot always be sure which of these explanations applies, and the impulse to resolve that discomfort by reaching for the most dramatic available interpretation is worth noticing. The third projection concerns abandonment. The sites we have visited and the ones we will visit share a common feature: they were all at some point left. The people who built them and maintained them eventually stopped doing so, and the structures entered the long process of decay that archaeology then interrupts. Popular accounts of ancient site abandonment tend to reach for dramatic explanations: invasion, catastrophe, sudden collapse, the intervention of forces that arrived without warning and ended everything at once. But the archaeological evidence for most of these sites suggests something considerably more gradual and considerably less legible than dramatic collapse. Populations shift, resources become less reliable, political authority reorganizes around different centers, trade routes change. The social agreement that made a particular place worth maintaining dissolves not in a single event, but across decades or generations in ways that leave no clear marker in the physical record. The absence of explanation is not itself evidence of something dramatic. It is more often evidence of the ordinary human difficulty of maintaining complex social arrangements across time. And yet, having said all of this, having noted the projections and the assumptions and the interpretive leaps, something remains. The pattern that sits underneath the skeptical account is this: across a very wide range of cultures, geographic locations, and historical periods, people built large and complex structures that oriented themselves toward the sky, that treated the boundary between the living and the dead as something requiring architectural mediation, and that demanded levels of coordinated labour far in excess of what immediate practical survival would have required. That pattern is not an illusion. It is not a product of selective attention or wishful thinking. It is present in the physical record across 5 continents and several millennia, and it asks a question that the skeptical account for all its necessary corrections does not fully answer either. Not what these people knew or how they built what they built, but what they understood themselves to be doing. What frame of meaning made this level of effort feel to them not excessive but exactly right? That question remains quietly after every projection has been set aside, and it is that question we continue to follow. From the skeptic's pause, we move now toward the Atlantic coast of Ireland, where a mound on a hill has been asking a version of it for 5,000 years. The mound that faces winter. The Hill of Tara sits in County Meath in the Irish Midlands, rising gently from the surrounding farmland, to a height that, while not dramatic by any mountainous measure, offers on a clear day a view across a significant portion of the island. It is the kind of elevation that a society organising itself across a landscape would notice, not because it is unreachable, but because it is visible, because from its crown you can see in most directions far enough to matter, and because the fact of being seen from a distance carries its own form of authority. Tara was the ceremonial seat of the High Kings of Ireland, for a period stretching across more than a millennium, a place where political legitimacy was not simply declared but performed enacted in rituals whose to specific content we know only in fragments filtered through texts written centuries after the practices they describe had already changed beyond recognition. And at the northeastern edge of the hill's summit complex, partially buried under the turf, sits a structure that predates the high kingship tradition by more than 2,000 years. A passage tomb known as the Mound of the Hostages, built around 3000 BC, whose entrance was aligned by its builders with the rising sun on the mornings around the cross-quarter day of Samhain in early November, a point in the calendar that sits between the autumn equinox and the winter solstice, marking the moment when, in the agricultural and spiritual traditions of the region, the boundary between the living world and the world of the dead was understood to be at its thinnest. That alignment is not approximate. The passage is narrow less than a metre wide in places, and the angle at which it was constructed corresponds with a precision that eliminates coincidence as a reasonable explanation. The builders knew what they were doing in the technical sense. They understood the geometry of the hillside and the angle of the November sunrise well enough to cut and place a corridor of stone that would channel the light to a specific point at a specific time of year. Whether they understood this as an act of engineering, an act of devotion, or something for which neither of those categories is adequate, is a question the passage itself cannot answer. What it can do and what it continues to do on the relevant mornings each year is fill with light in a way that everyone present agrees is not incidental. The interior of the mound held when archaeologists first examined it systematically in the 20th century the remains of more than 200 individuals deposited over a period spanning several centuries. The earliest burials were cremations, the bones of adults placed in the inner chamber with care that implies ritual rather than simple disposal. Later burials from the Bronze Age were inhumations bodies placed in a flexed position with grave goods that reflect the changing material culture of successive periods. The mound was used across a time span long enough that the people who placed their dead in its later phases could not have had direct cultural continuity with those who built it. They were in a meaningful sense burying their dead in a monument left by people they had no direct memory of, whose beliefs and practices had been transformed by the intervening centuries. The fact that they continued to use it suggests that the structure retained authority across that transformation, that it was recognized as a place of significance, even when the specific significance may have shifted considerably from its original form. The name attached to the monument in later Irish tradition, Doomha, Nungiel, the Mound of the Hostages, refers to a practice that belongs to the Iron Age political culture of Tara, not to the Neolithic community that built the tomb. High kings, according to the tradition, kept hostages from subordinate kingdoms at Tara as a guarantee of political compliance, and the mound became associated with this practice in the cultural memory of the site. The name is, in other words, a later layer, a political meaning applied to a structure whose original meaning belonged to an entirely different framework. This kind of layering is common at ancient sites, and it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. A monument survives for long enough to become part of a landscape that no longer shares its original context. New people arrive, or the same people change it enough that continuity of memory has broken, and the structure receives a new name, a new story, a new set of associations that make it legible within the current world. What the original name was, if there was a name in a culture that did not write, is not recoverable. What persists is the geometry of the passage, the angle of the light, and the bones of the people who are placed inside. The broader complex of monuments on the hill of Tara adds a context that the mound alone cannot provide. The Mound of the Hostages sits within a larger enclosure known as the Forad, or the royal seat, and near structures including the Raith na Riu of the Fort of the Kings, whose earthworks cover a substantial area of the hilltop. Scattered across and around the hill are additional earthworks, standing stones, and the traces of structures whose original form is still being established through geophysical survey. The cumulative pictures of a place that attracted sustained monumental investment across an extraordinarily long period from the Neolithic through the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age and beyond, as though the hill itself held a quality that successive cultures recognized and responded to, each in the idiom available to them. Whether that quality was purely geographic, the visibility, the central position in the island's landscape, or whether it reflected something about the specific place that is not reducible to its practical advantages, is a question the archaeological record keeps open. What the Mound of the Hostages offers, finally, is a small and precise thing within a very large and imprecise context. One corridor, one angle, one morning each year, when the light does what the builders intended it to do. Everything surrounding that precision, the name, the political associations, the layers of subsequent use, the question of what the original community believed about the dead and the sun and the passage between states is uncertain, contested, or simply unknown. The precision remains, and from this hilltop in Meath, where the November light still finds its way through a 5,000-year-old doorway, we travel now to the Highlands of Scotland, where another group of people built a different kind of corridor, not a single passage, but a cluster of circular mounds arranged across a valley floor in ways that the landscape itself seems to have required. The circle and the cairn. One date in the record of the Balnuaran of Clava is worth holding for a moment before anything else is said about the site. The cairns were built approximately 4,000 years ago during the period archaeologists describe as the transition between the late Neolithic and the early Bronze Age, a boundary that is more useful as a label than as a description of lived experience, since the people who constructed these monuments would not have recognised themselves as standing at the edge of one era and the beginning of another. What they would have recognised is the valley of the River Nairn in what is now the Scottish Highlands. The specific quality of light in that landscape in different seasons, the positions of the hills on the horizon, and the behaviour of the winter sun as it tracked its low arc across the southern sky and set on the shortest days of the year at an angle that the builders of Balnuaran recorded in stone with a precision that 4,000 years has not disturbed. The site consists of 3 main cairns arranged in a roughly linear pattern across the valley floor, each one a circular mound of carefully placed stones enclosed by a ring of standing monoliths. The cairns are not identical. They vary in diameter and in the details of their construction, but they share structural features consistent enough to indicate that they were conceived as a group, rather than as isolated monuments built at different times by different communities with different intentions. Each cairn is encircled by its standing stones which are graded in height, so that the tallest tall stones stand at the southwest, and the shortest at the northeast, creating a deliberate asymmetry in the ring that mirrors a pattern repeated consistently across all 3 monuments. This grading is not a consequence of available stone or site geography. It's a choice made 3 times over that oriented each monument in a specific direction and gave the enclosing ring a directionality that points with a consistency difficult to attribute to coincidence toward the midwinter sunset in the southwest. Inside each cairn, a stone-lined passage leads from the exterior into a central chamber. The passages are aligned so that the light of the midwinter sun setting low in the southwest sky on the days around the winter solstice enters the passage and reaches the back wall of the chamber. This alignment works. Archaeologists and astronomers who have measured it confirm that the geometry is intentional and precise, and that the effect it produces, the gradual filling of a stone chamber with the last light of the shortest day, is not a natural accident of the cairn's position in the landscape, but a designed outcome that required its builders to understand both the behaviour of the winter sun and the spatial requirements of a stone passage oriented to receive it. How that understanding was held and transmitted, whether through accumulated observation passed between generations, through a specialist knowledge held by particular individuals, or through some other form of cultural continuity we cannot directly access, is not something the cairns themselves can tell us. The burials found within the cairns are consistent with their interpretation as monuments for the dead, but the relationship between the burial function and the solar alignment is one of the genuinely interesting interpretive problems the site presents. If the chambers were designed to receive the light of the midwinter sun, and if they were also used to house the remains of the dead, then the alignment was not incidental to the burial, it was integral to it. The dead were placed in chambers that the sun would enter on the year's darkest turning point. Whether this reflects a belief that the sun's light at midwinter carried the power to carry the dead toward whatever came after life, or that the moment of the solstice was when the boundary between the living and the dead was most permeable, or something else entirely, that these categories do not capture, cannot be determined from the physical evidence. What can be said is that the builders of Balnuaran understood the winter solstice as a moment worth commemorating in permanent stone, and that they connected that moment explicitly to the space where their dead were placed. The two things, the astronomical and the funerary, were not separate concerns to be addressed by separate structures. They were woven together into a single architectural gesture. The standing stones that encircle each cairn introduce another layer of complexity. Many of them carry cut marks, small circular depressions ground into the surface of the stone, a form of marking found widely across Neolithic and Bronze Age Britain and Ireland, whose meaning remains genuinely unclear. Cut marks appear on standing stones on the walls of passage tombs or natural rock outcroppings, and on portable objects in distributions that suggest they carried significance across a wide geographic and temporal range without settling into any single interpretive framework. At Balnuaran, some of the cut mark stones are positioned in ways that seem to relate to the solar alignment placed at points in the encircling ring that correspond to the passage's orientation. But whether this relationship is structural, symbolic, or incidental is a question the evidence holds open. The marks were made by someone who considered them worth making in a place already invested with considerable effort and intention. What they said to the people who made them has not survived in any form we can directly read. The Balnuaran cairns were not used indefinitely. Evidence suggests that the passages were deliberately blocked at some point after the initial period of use, the entrances filled with stone in a way that appears intentional, as though the decision to close them was as considered as the decision to build them. Whether this reflects the end of a specific ritual practice, a change in the community's beliefs about the dead and what the dead required, or simply the passage of enough time that the monuments had become ancestral rather than active, belonging to the past rather than the present, is not answerable from the blocking stones alone. What it suggests is that the life of a monument and the life of the practice it was built to support are not the same thing, and that the moment when a community stops using a structure it built with great care is as meaningful in its way as the moment it began. From this valley in the Scottish Highlands, where the midwinter sun still reaches toward chambers that have been sealed for 3,000 years, we move now southward to a plateau in Bulgaria, where a different civilization cut its sacred spaces not from assembled stones, but directly from the living rock beneath their feet. What was cut from the mountain? The rock at Perperikon was not brought to the site. It was already there, a massif of rhyolite rising from the Rhodope Mountains in what is now southern Bulgaria, a natural formation of compressed volcanic stone that the Thracians, sometime in the 5th millennium BC, began to cut into rather than build upon. This distinction matters more than it might initially appear. When a civilization quarries stone and transports it to a chosen location, the act of construction involves a negotiation between the builder and the material the stone is shaped to fit the design. When a civilization cuts directly into the rock of a mountain, the negotiation runs in the other direction. The mountain is already there. Its form, its mass, its relationship to the surrounding landscape, its position relative to the horizon and the sky. These are given conditions that the builders must work within and around. Whatever Perperikon was built to be, it was built in full acknowledgement of what the mountain already was. The site did not impose itself on the landscape and grew from it or was extracted from it in a process that suggests the mountain itself was understood as already significant before the first cut was made. The complex that accumulated at Perperikon over the millennia spans a remarkable temporal range. The earliest human activity at the site dates to the 5th millennium BC, making it among the older continuously used sacred sites in Europe, but the period of most intensive construction and use falls in the 1st millennium BC, during the height of Thracian cultural development. The Thracians are one of the ancient world's more poorly documented civilizations, known to their Greek and Roman neighbours, mentioned in texts that reflect those neighbours' perspectives and preoccupations rather than Thracian self-understanding, and leaving behind no written records of their own that have survived in legible form. What they left instead was golden craftsmanship of extraordinary quality, and a series of sacred sites cut into the rocky landscapes of the Balkans, whose purposes have been reconstructed from the physical evidence and from the second-hand accounts of people who observed Thracian practices from the outside and filtered what they saw through their own interpretive frameworks. Perperikon is the most extensive of these sites, and it is correspondingly the one where the gap between what survives and what it meant is most fully felt. The terraces at Perperikon were cut from the rock face in a series of levels that follow the natural contours of the massif while reorganizing them into usable horizontal planes, bases where structures could be built, where people could gather, where the activities of a functioning sacred center could take place across the different elevations of the site. The scale of this earth moving is difficult to absorb without standing in front of it. Thousands of cubic meters of rock were removed not to create a flat and featureless platform, but to produce a complex spatial arrangement of terraces stairs, passageways and chambers that use the mountain's existing form as both material and frame. The structures that rose on these terraces, walls, pillars, roofed halls whose outlines can still be traced, were built partly from the cut stone and partly from the mountain's own surface, which in places serves directly as floor or wall. The boundary between the built and the natural is not sharp per Perpericon. It was apparently not intended to be. The feature that has attracted the most sustained attention is the large rock-cut sanctuary on the upper levels of the site, which researchers have associated with appropriate caution with the worship of Dionysus, the deity who in the Greek tradition that absorbed and partially translated Thracian religious practice governed wine fertility, ecstatic ritual, and the boundary between the human and the divine. The association rests on the circular stone basins, carved directly into the rock surface of the sanctuary, which appear designed to hold liquid, and on the presence nearby of what seem to be altar platforms oriented towards specific points on the horizon. Wine in the ancient Thracian context was not simply a beverage. It was a vehicle, a means by which the ordinary boundaries of human perception could be temporarily dissolved, and by which the worshipper could approach or be approached by forces that normal consciousness kept at a distance. A sanctuary designed for rituals involving wine cut into the top of a mountain, with views extending across the valleys in every direction, situated at the intersection of natural and built space. This is a description of a place designed for a specific kind of experience, one in which the physical environment was understood to be an active participant in what occurred there. The Thracian connection to the wider Mediterranean world adds a dimension that complicates simple regional interpretation. Thracian goldwork has been found across an area stretching from the Black Sea coast to the Aegean and beyond, and the quality of this metalwork, the precision of its casting, the sophistication of its decorative vocabulary indicates a culture that was engaged with the broader ancient world, not as a peripheral observer, but as a participant with something of its own to contribute. Perpericon, positioned in the Rhodope range at a geographic point that sits between the Aegean world to the south and the continental interior to the north, may have functioned as a site where these different cultural currents converged, a place where Greeks, Thracians, and peoples from further afield came together in a context defined by the sacred geography of the mountain rather than by the political boundaries of any particular kingdom. Whether this convergence was primarily commercial, primarily religious, or organized around some framework that did not separate these activities is a question the site cannot resolve on its own terms. The Romans arrived in the region in the 1st century BC, and Perpericon's role as a living sacred centre appears to have diminished in the centuries that followed, though. The site was not immediately abandoned. Later occupation layers suggest continued use in forms that reflect the changed political and religious landscape of the Roman period. What was lost was not the physical site, but the specific cultural framework within which the site had been meaningful. The Thracian understanding of what a mountain required of the people who lived near it, and what those people could ask of the mountain in return. That understanding is not recoverable from the terraces and basins and cut stone walls that remain. What remains is the evidence that it existed, and that it shaped stone in ways still visible to anyone willing to climb to the upper levels and look at what was made. From this mountain in Bulgaria carved over millennia into a form that the mountain itself seems to have permitted, we move now to a coastline in France, where a different kind of shaping took place, not cutting down into rock but raising up from the earth in rows that stretch further than the eye can follow. The row that has no end. 4,000 years of weather have not moved them. That is the first thing worth saying about the standing stones of Karnak. Before any theory about their purpose is introduced, before any argument about their alignment is engaged with, before the question of who arranged them and why is even raised. More than 3,000 individual stone ranging from ankle height to the height of a 2-story building were placed in rows across the landscape of Brittany in northwestern France, sometime around 4000 BC, and they remain with relatively few exceptions approximately where they were put. The rows extend across several kilometres of gently rolling coastal terrain organised into distinct groupings, the alignments of Menek Camario and Kurlesken being the largest and most studied, each one a series of parallel lines of stones that run roughly east to west across the landscape with a consistency of direction that persists across kilometres of varied topography. A line of stones that maintains its orientation across hills, wetlands and the natural irregularities of a coastal landscape is not a line produced by accident or convenience. It is a line that someone decided should continue and continued it stone by stone across ground that would not always have made the work easy. The people who built the Karnak alignments belonged to the Neolithic cultures of Atlantic Europe communities whose relationship to the landscape was organised around agriculture seasonal cycles and a sustained engagement with the monumental in stone that expressed itself differently in different places, but with a consistency of impulse that spans the entire Atlantic facade from Portugal to Scotland. They did not write. They left no texts, no inscriptions, no annotated plans of what they intended to build or why. What they left is the stones themselves and the spatial relationships between them, and the ways in which certain rows at certain times of year orient themselves towards specific points on the horizon, where the sun or moon rises or sets at moments the agricultural and ceremonial calendar would have marked as significant. Some of the rows at Karnak align with the summer solstice sunrise with a precision that exceeds what casual arrangement would produce. Some researchers have proposed more elaborate astronomical interpretations that the entire complex functioned as a kind of landscape-scale instrument for tracking the movements of the moon across its longer cycles, including the 18.6-year lunar standstill that the builders of Chaco Canyon on the other side of the world appear to have also encoded into their architecture. Whether the Karnak builders were doing something analogous using the extended geometry of the alignments to record or predict Gita celestial events across time frames longer than a single human life remains a question the stones cannot answer with the directness that would settle it. What the stones can offer, and what they offer consistently to anyone who walks among them, is a quality of spatial experience that is not incidental to their arrangement. The rows create corridors. Moving along the line of an alignment with stones of varying height on either side produces a sense of directed movement, the landscape organised into a pathway that the body follows without being explicitly instructed to. At the western ends of some alignments, the rows converge into roughly circular enclosures, cromlech formations where the stones are arranged in an arc that creates a bounded space distinct from the open corridor of the rows themselves. These enclosures are among the most discussed features of the site, because they suggest that the rows were not simply linear, that they had destinations, that the movement they organised was directed toward a specific kind of arrival. What occurred in these enclosed spaces, whether gathering ceremony, seasonal observance, or something that does not translate cleanly into any of these categories, is not recorded anywhere. The enclosures exist. The rows lead to them. The inference that this arrangement was intentional is difficult to resist, and the further inference that the intention involved the directed movement of people through a designed landscape toward a designed conclusion is at least as plausible as any alternative explanation. The detail that resists easy dismissal is that this spatial, logic corridor leading to enclosure movement organised toward arrival appears in sacred architecture across many cultures and many periods, as though something in the human experience of approaching a significant place benefits from being structured as a journey with a legible direction. The variety of the stones themselves introduces a complication that the more systematic interpretations of Karnak tend to underemphasize. Unlike Stonehenge, where the architectural logic depends on the stones being of a consistent size and shape, the Karnak alignments include stones that range enormously in height, from fragments barely above ground level to the great menhirs that rise several meters into the air. This variation is not uniform across the alignments in some rows. The stones decrease in height from west to east in a gradient that appears deliberate, as though the diminishing scale was intended to produce a specific visual effect when viewed from a particular direction. In other sections, the variation seems less systematic, more responsive to the available stone or the local topography. Whether the entire complex was designed as a unified whole or accumulated over a long period through successive additions by communities that shared a general tradition. But not a single plan is a question that current dating methods have not fully resolved. The alignments may span several centuries of construction rather than representing a single sustained project, which would mean that the coherence we perceive in them today is partly the product of accumulated decisions made by different people at different times, each building in relation to what was already there. The Grand Menhir of Loch Marriach, where a few kilometres from the main alignments, once stood at over 20 metres, the tallest known standing stone in Europe, before it fell and shattered into the 4 massive fragments that now lie in the grass near the burial mound of Ergra. It weighed in its intact form an estimated 330 tons. How it was quarried, transported, and erected by a Neolithic community without metal tools or wheeled vehicles is a question that experimental archaeology has approached but not definitively answered. That it was done is not in doubt. That the effort required was extraordinary by any measure is not in doubt. What it means that such effort was considered appropriate, even necessary, for the construction of a single standing stone in a landscape already populated by thousands of them. That question opens outward in ways that the monument itself, now horizontal and broken, continues to ask in silence. And from this coast of arranged stone we move now across the Atlantic to a canyon in New Mexico where a different civilization built its monuments not in rows across a plain, but in precise alignment with a cycle of the moon that takes nearly 2 decades to complete. The road that points at the moon, the roads at Chaco Canyon do not meander. That is what makes them unusual, and what makes them difficult to explain away as the simple product of repeated foot traffic along convenient routes. Roads formed by use, paths worn into the ground by generations of people walking between 2 points tend to curve around obstacles to seek the easiest gradient to follow the logic of least resistance across a landscape. The roads at Chaco Canyon in northwestern New Mexico do not do this. They run straight. They hold their direction across washes and ridges and sections of terrain where a straight line requires considerably more effort to travel than a curved one would. In some places the road was cut into the bedrock or bordered by low stone curbs, or accompanied by parallel roads running a fixed distance to either side, a design that implies not simply movement from one place to another, but movement organized according to a principle that the destination alone does not explain. A road built for pure utility needs only to connect two points efficiently. A road built straight through difficult terrain, doubled and curbed and cut into stone, is making a statement of a different kind about what a road is for. The Chaco road system extends outward from the canyon floor in multiple directions, connecting the central complex of great houses and ceremonial structures to smaller communities scattered across the San Juan Basin over distances of up to 90 kilometers. The scale of this network is not what one might expect from a settlement that archaeologists estimate at its peak between AD 900 and 1150 housed a population in the low thousands, a number that does not, by the standards of ancient urbanism, seem to warrant infrastructure of this elaborateness. The roads were wider than practical movement required. Their surfaces were sometimes prepared with a care that went beyond what bare functionality demanded, and their straightness maintained across topography that frequently made straight lines. The harder choice suggests that the organizing principle behind them was not efficiency in any conventional sense, but something closer to intention, a desire that the road should be what it is, should go where it goes in exactly the way it does, regardless of what the landscape might prefer. The great houses of Chaco Pueblo Bonito being the largest and most studied, a 5-story complex of several hundred rooms, arranged in a carefully planned D-shape against the canyon's north wall, are oriented with a precision that extends the road system's logic into the architecture itself. The cardinal directions are reflected in the placement of walls and doorways. The great kivas, the large circular ceremonial chambers that punctuate the canyon complex, are positioned in relation to each other and to the surrounding landscape in ways that some researchers have interpreted as a spatial map of cosmological relationships, the arrangement of sacred space on the ground mirroring an understanding of the arrangement of sacred space in the skies. Whether this interpretation is correct in its specifics or whether it overreads the evidence is a question that specialists continue to debate. What is not debated is the precision of the orientation, or the fact that whoever planned these structures was paying close and sustained attention to the relationship between built space and astronomical direction. The lunar standstill connection is the detail that sits most uncomfortably within simple explanation. Every 6 years, the moon reaches the extreme limits of its rising and setting positions on the horizon, points further north and south than at any other time in its cycle, a phenomenon called the major lunar standstill. The geometry of certain structures at Chaco, including specific wall alignments and the placement of particular doorways, appears to reflect this 18.6-year cycle with a precision that multiple independent researchers have confirmed through survey and calculation. To encode a cycle of nearly 2 decades into a built structure requires sustained observation across at least one full cycle, and ideally across several, in order to establish that the extreme positions have in fact been reached and to measure them with sufficient accuracy to translate into architectural dimensions. This is not a casual undertaking. It implies a community that was tracking the moon's behavior across generations, passing the observations and the measurements from one cohort of observers to the next, maintaining the continuity of an astronomical project that no single person could complete within their own lifetime. The knowledge that made Chaco's lunar alignments possible was by definition collective and transgenerational. It was held not in instruments but in people, in the transmission of careful observation through whatever forms of education and cultural memory the community sustained. Pueblo Bonito's Great Cavir, when examined in the context of its orientation, adds a layer that the purely astronomical account leaves partially addressed. The kiva is not an observatory. In the functional sense, it is not designed to provide clear sightlines to the horizon, and its subterranean form would have made astronomical observation from within it impractical. It was a ceremonial space, a place where the community gathered for purposes that the physical evidence fire pit's ritual deposits the remains of offerings, indicates were religious rather than scientific in any distinction we would recognize. What the astronomical alignments of the surrounding architecture suggest is not that Chaco was an observatory staffed by astronomers, but that the religious practices conducted in these spaces were organized around astronomical events in a way that made the precision of the alignment theologically necessary. The moon's standstill was not being measured for its own sake. It was being honored, incorporated, made present in stone as part of a framework in which celestial cycles were understood to be directly relevant to human life and its continuation. The detail that lingers is the 6-year cycle itself, a period so much longer than a single agricultural season, so much more demanding to track than the annual movements of the sun that its presence in the architecture implies a community for whom the long rhythms of the sky were as meaningful as the short ones and worth more effort to record. The abandonment of Chaco Canyon in the mid-12th century is one of the more discussed episodes in North American prehistory, and one of the less resolved. Tree ring records from the canyon's timber supply indicate a series of severe droughts in the decades preceding the abandonment periods, during which the agricultural base that supported the canyon's population would have been under serious stress. This environmental pressure is widely accepted as a contributing factor. Whether it was sufficient on its own to explain the emptying of a complex that had sustained itself and grown across more than 2 centuries, or whether social and political factors compounded the agricultural difficulty in ways the physical record cannot directly show, is a question the evidence holds open. What the canyon became afterward, a place visited but not inhabited in the same way, a site that later Pueblo peoples and the Navajo and Hopi communities whose traditions developed in the wider region continued to regard as sacred, suggests that the meaning attributed to Chaco did not entirely depart with the population that had built it. The roads continued to exist, the alignments continued to function. The great houses continued to stand in various states of weathering as structures that landscape had not yet returned entirely to itself. What the people who built them understood themselves to have made what the roads were, for what the alignment of a doorway to the moonrise meant within the framework of their beliefs is carried now only in the traditions of those whose relationship to the canyon outlasted the canyon's active life. And from the desert silence of Chaco we turn at last to the shores of the Atlantic, where the final movement of this long night begins, among tombs and cliff-edge walls, and a passage in Wales where the summer light still enters a chamber that was built 5,000 years ago to receive it. The light that was expected. On the morning of the summer solstice, the sun rises over a low ridge on the Isle of Anglesey, at an angle that has not meaningfully changed in 5,000 years. The geometry of the Earth's tilt is stable across timescales that dwarf recorded history, and so the light that enters the passage at Brincelli Dhu on the longest morning of the year enters it now at approximately the same angle, travelling the same 11 metres through the same stone corridor, reaching the same back wall of the same inner chamber, as it did when the people who built the passage were alive to see it. This continuity is not symbolic, it is physical. The alignment works because the relationship between the Earth and the Sun that the builders encoded into the passage's geometry has not changed, and the passage itself, for all the millennia of weathering and excavation and scholarly attention it has absorbed, remains oriented in the direction it was built to face. The light arrives, it was expected, it still comes. Brincelli Dhu translates from Welsh as the mound in the dark grove, and the name carries something of the site's quality, a sense of enclosure of something significant happening, in a place set apart from ordinary ground. The mound sits in the gentle farmland of Anglesey, unassuming from a distance a low grassy rise that does not announce itself with the drama of a hilltop monument or a cliff-edge fortress. What it announces instead is the passage, that long, narrow corridor of carefully placed stone slabs that leads the body inward toward a chamber that receives once a year the year's longest light. Inside the chamber, archaeologists found the remains of human burials, the bones of people placed there, with the deliberateness that ritual requires in a space that their community had designed to be illuminated by the sun at the height of summer. The dead and the solstice light were brought together in the same architectural gesture. Whatever the builders believed about what happens after death, they built for it as though the sun's involvement in that transition was not metaphorical but operational, as though the light of the longest morning was not simply present in the chamber, but active within it, doing something that the burial required. The passage at Bryncelli Didu is one end of a thread that has run through this entire night, a thread connecting the solar corridor at the Mound of the Hostages on the Hill of Tara, the midwinter chambers of the Balnuar and of Clava, the lunar alignments cut into the architecture of Chaco Canyon, the star-oriented temples of Sambia Pre Cook, and the rows of Karnak reaching across the Breton landscape toward their western enclosures, where the solstice sun still touches the stone it was aimed at 4 millennia ago. These are not the same culture, not the same period, not the same religious framework, not the same part of the world. What they share is a decision made independently across enormous distances of geography and time to build in such a way that the sky was incorporated into the structure, that the movement of the sun or the moon or the stars was not simply observed, but encoded, made permanent, given an architectural form that would continue to function long after the people who designed it had gone. The pattern is real. What it means about the inner lives of the people who produced it is the question that remains and that will remain, because the evidence for it is in stone and bone, and the angle of morning light, and not in anything that can be read. At Dun Aongasa on the Aran Islands, the walls rise to the edge of a cliff 200 feet above the Atlantic, and simply stop as though the boundary the fort was marking needed no continuation beyond the point where the land ended. Whether the fort was a military structure, a ceremonial site, a residence for people whose authority required a certain quality of drama in their surroundings, or all of these things at once, in a culture that did not organize life by separating them. Whoa, the cliff answers none of these questions, but frames all of them. The ocean beyond the wall is not nothing. It is the condition within which the wall's meaning was produced. A fort at the edge of the known world built by people who presumably knew it was the edge, who chose the edge deliberately, who put their most substantial and enduring structure at the place where the land stopped and the open water began. This is a statement about orientation, about the relationship between a community and the horizon it faced that the purely tactical explanation leaves incompletely accounted for. What this long night has offered is not answers. It has offered the sites themselves, the physical facts of stone and alignment and construction and abandonment, and the space between those facts and any complete understanding of them. Los Millares and its layered walls, Mergar and its carved symbols, Gurness and its gallery-lined tower, the cyclopean stones of Rajgir, the fired brick of Sambor Pre Cook, the solar passage of Tara, the midwinter cairns of Clava, the rock-cut terraces of Perpericon, the rows of Karnak, the roads of Chaco, and finally this passage in Anglesey, where the summer light finds the chamber. It was built to enter each site as a record of human attention applied with extraordinary effort and care to problems that were not purely practical. Each one is evidence of a community that looked at the world it inhabited and decided that the relationship between its structures and the movements of the sky, between its living and its dead, between the ground beneath its feet and the forces it perceived operating above and beyond. That ground was worth encoding in permanent material at enormous cost of labour and time and organisational capacity. We do not know in most cases what they believed. We know that they built for it as though it mattered absolutely, and the light on the mornings it was designed for still comes. On the morning of the summer solstice, the sun rises over Anglesey at an angle that has not changed in 5,000 years. We began there, and we return there now, not because the passage at Bryncelli Didu holds an answer we missed the first time, but because the image of light travelling 11 metres through stone to reach a wall that was built to receive it is in the end the most honest summary of everything this night has moved through. Someone built a corridor for the light. The light came. It still comes. Whatever was intended by that act, whatever framework of belief, whatever our understanding of the dead and the sun and the relationship between them, has not survived in any form we can read directly. What survived is the geometry. The intention outlasted the explanation of itself, which may be the most human thing about it. That is the condition of most of what we have followed tonight. The walls of Los Millares still stand in partial form, but the community that decided where to place each ring of stone and what the enclosed space between the rings was meant to protect or produce is gone beyond recovery. The symbols on the walls and floors of Mergar were made by someone who had reasons for making them in a settlement that had already mastered urban planning and agricultural management 8,000 years ago, and those reasons have not come down to us. The galleries within the walls of the Broch of Gurness were built with care that the structural explanation alone does not account for, and what that care was expressing, what quality of interior space the builders were trying to create within the boundary of their tower, is something we can feel the outline of without being able to name it. This is not a failure of archaeology or of attention or of the tools we have developed for reading the past. It is the ordinary condition of deep time. History does not preserve meaning the way it preserves stone. The stone endures. The meaning travels in people, and when the people change enough or disperse enough or are replaced by others whose relationship to the stone is different, the meaning changes with them or is lost entirely. What remains is the physical fact, still legible in its dimensions, still measurable in its alignment, still capable of catching the light it was built to catch, but silent about what that light was supposed to do. There is something almost restful in that silence once you stop expecting it to resolve. These sites have been waiting a long time for someone to ask the right question, and they will continue waiting patiently and without urgency long after every question we can currently formulate has been posed and considered and set aside. The cairns of Clava will keep their midwinter alignment. The roads of Chaco will keep their straightness across the desert. The rock-cut terraces of Pepericon will keep the impressions of the tools that shaped them. None of them require our understanding in order to continue being what they are. They were made without us, and they persist without us, and our attempts to account for them are a small and relatively recent addition to the very long story of what those stones have been present for. You do not need to carry the questions with you into sleep. They will still be there when you return to them. Unhurried, unchanged, patient, the way stone is patient, which is to say, without any investment in the outcome. One thing lingers quiet and unresolved. Somewhere in the distance between what was built and what was meant, there is a space that no measurement has closed, and that space oddly feels less like absence than like room. Rest now, traveller. The corridors have been walked, the alignments have been noted. The stones have said what they are able to say, and the rest, the larger part, the part that would answer every question this night has asked, belongs to a silence older than any of the structures we have visited and more complete. Let the walls of Andalusia recede. Let the carved symbols of the Bolan pass, fade back into their 8,000-year quiet. Let the November light leave the passage on the hill of Tara, and the midwinter sun withdraw from the cairns of the River Nairn, and the long, straight roads of Chaco dissolve back into the desert that has been slowly reclaiming them for 9 centuries. The night holds all of it, the built and the abandoned, the aligned and the broken, the explained and the irresolvably open. You are held in the same stillness that holds the stones. Breathe into it. Let the questions go soft at their edges, the way stone goes soft in long rain, becoming something rounder and quieter than it was. Sleep well. The mysteries will keep.